out of curiosity, I don't know if you like to share this, but I know people are going to be wondering, what diet did you switch from your bodybuilder bro red meat diet after you did the research? And how did you begin eating?
I shifted to a more pescatarian diet at that stage.
Okay.
And, I think let's be pragmatic here. Within that theme that I just described and also in the literature, if the question was, okay, based on that, what do you think is realistically the best diet to go out and recommend for public health to a population at large, not to an individual? Then it's going to be some form of the Mediterranean diet.
Can you break down exactly what that means?
All right, so a Mediterranean diet is a diet that has an abundance of fruits and vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes. From a fat perspective, it has more of a bias to monounsaturated fats and unsaturated fats. So fatty fish, olive oil, and obviously the nuts and seeds. And there is room and inclusion for meat in there, but it tends to be leaner cuts of meat. So the overall saturated fat content of that diet typically falls below 10% of energy, which is different to the diets that we see in a Western country. And that diet is going to probably be the best diet from an adherence point of view for the population at mass. It doesn't require a lot of education. As you start going down more towards pescatarian, vegetarian, vegan, much more education is needed with regards to optimizing that diet to make sure you're getting all the nutrients that you need and you're doing it in a way that is healthy. Because you can do those diets in a really healthy way or you can do them in a very poor way.
Yeah.
And that's, probably the best dietary guidelines that I'm aware of are the Danish dietary guidelines.
What are the Danish dietary guidelines?
I did print out.
We love printouts on the show.
We can maybe put this into the show notes, but the Danish dietary guidelines, these came out in 2021. Their recommendations, they have 7 recommendations.
Okay.
Eat plant-rich, varied, and not too much. Not too much is really speaking to the importance of energy balance because we know that excessive adiposity or fat brings a lot of risks for chronic disease. So 1, eat plant-rich, varied, and not too much. 2, eat more vegetables and fruit. 3, eat less meat, choose legumes and fish. 4, eat whole grain foods. 5, choose vegetable oils and low-fat dairy products. 6, eat less sweet, salty, and fatty food. 7, thirsty, drink water. Now, there's probably a few things in there that maybe in the online space are controversial, but within academia, 90+% of that is absolutely agreed upon. And where I think the general public gets a little bit confused is people think, well, hang on, the guidelines have been out there and look at the health of the typical person in a country like America, where 50% of people have cardiovascular disease, 70% of people are overweight or obese, 40% of people have pre-diabetes, the list goes on and on. What we need to understand is that is not how people are eating.
But is the food pyramid in America completely different to those guidelines?
It is slightly different to that, but the big picture items are the same. Okay. And if you were to adhere to the dietary guidelines, right, we have studies that have shown this, there would be a dramatic reduction in risk of chronic disease and incidence of chronic disease. There was a study out of the UK in the last year looking at data from the UK Biobank study, which is a large population study. And they were interested in looking at what percentage of people within that population were adhering to global sort of international dietary recommendations. And they were looking at, I think, 4 components. It was the saturated fat content of the diet being below 10%. They were looking at fiber intake being above a certain level. They were looking at fruit and vegetable consumption, and they were looking at added sugars.
Can you just give some examples of saturated fats, just for anyone who doesn't know?
Right. And there are different types of saturated fats.
Okay.
So again, this is where context matters, and you can come to erroneous conclusions if you're not aware of different types of saturated fats. So, but in short, saturated fats within typical diets are generally coming from meat, butter, dairy, and then coconut oil, palm oil.
Okay.
Those are the very saturated fat rich sources.
And what would
foods.
vegetable oil be considered?
But just in saying that though, just so that I'm clear here, you can eat meat that's low in saturated fat. Like leaner cuts of meat,
like venison,
have much less saturated fat in them.
Okay.
And the saturated fats that are in meat do not have the same effect on physiology as the saturated fats in dairy, for example.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what would vegetable oil be considered?
So vegetable oil would be considered anything from olive, avocado, canola.
But that's not a
sunflower.
saturated fat.
These are monounsaturated or polyunsaturated fat, or a mixture of both.
That was the thing that surprised me the most. I think on the Danish food guidelines,
Mm-hmm.
they're recommending vegetable oil.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a huge movement away from vegetable oil. Can you explain why that's considered healthier?
Yeah, I think people are conflating vegetable oils with ultra-processed foods, because a lot of ultra-processed foods contain vegetable oils, but we have to separate that and look at the independent or an inherent effect of vegetable oil itself. And we have clinical trials and meta-analyses of clinical trials where you look at the substitution of saturated fats in an isolated form for these vegetable oils, which contain unsaturated fats in an isolated form. And when you make those substitutions and you track people in clinical trials over years, and you pull all of that data from clinical trials across the world together, you see a significant reduction in risk of cardiovascular disease. And there's physiological explanations for that. We know that saturated fat, it basically, in simple kind of lay language, it reduces your liver's ability to bring cholesterol back in. And so saturated fats tend to increase serum cholesterol, whereas these unsaturated fats, particularly polyunsaturated fats, lower serum cholesterol.
Okay.
And we know that concentration of cholesterol affects your risk of cardiovascular disease.